Hello, everybody.
Recording is on.
Uh, so, as usual, I'll start with reading a talk, and I'll read slow so everyone can follow it. I think we'll still have plenty of time to talk. So, here are some dictionary provided synonyms for defer. Yeah, today we're talking about the deferral of violence. I'm sorry, I assume everyone knows that. Here are some dictionary provided synonyms for defer: postpone, put off, adjourn, delay, hold off, hold over, shelve, suspend, delay, hold in abeyance, stay, prorogue, pigeonhole, mothball. None of them quite get at how minimal deferral is conceptually, and how central it therefore is to the specificity of the originary hypothesis and to GA's decisive break with metaphysical forms of thinking. I won't go through all those synonyms one by one, but all of them involve a level or mode of intentionality that can't be attributed to defer. They all present a completed decision to not do something now, but rather to decide whether to do it later. If you're deferring, you're too much in the midst of things to make such a clear-cut distinction. Only deferral, that is, allows us to defer thinking as if we could step outside of the situation and get a non-participatory spectator's perspective of a completed event. On the originary scene, a distinction is constructed by all of the participants, a distinction between the convergence on the central object on the one hand and the renunciation of that object on the other. This is like a line drawn through the gesture of each participant. So the question is, who's best able to draw that line in an actionable manner? The one on the scene who is actually trying to draw it, or someone outside of the scene who could abstract from the event and reduce it to an external model or a set of rules? In that latter case, it would be possible to reduce the renunciation to a formal, generalizable rule in advance of any particular act of renunciation. It would be possible to find a cause leading to the act of renunciation, and this cause would then be found in our biological or some other pre-existing equipment, in which case the sign itself would simply be a superstructural reflection of some more foundational infrastructural reality. The singularity of the scene would be denied. Deferral, meanwhile, perfectly captures the position within the act itself, along with its fundamental contingency between the convergence headed toward destruction and what will perhaps be no more than the mere delay of that tendency. One can't know. One can't know any more that whatever gesture one puts forth might subtract from rather than accelerate the momentum dragging us along toward the catastrophe. Even this is not really knowledge, rather it's a slight injection of hope into the situation. Instead of preventing imminent destruction, we have really done no more than to make it imminently imminent. And that imminence of imminence gives us a little space within which to work. We can't even think in terms of whether the problem has been genuinely solved or kicked down the road, trivialized or covered up, or for that matter, irresponsibly avoided and thereby intensified to appear even more menacingly tomorrow. The categories which enable us to make even these distinctions are after the fact metaphysical accretions, even if we couldn't really avoid using them to describe what seem to be more or less effective gestures of deferral. And even this seeming is itself taking place on some mimetic scene, upon which the projected seeming itself defers some crisis. What then is the horizon of any act of deferral? What is its reach? Once we've deferred something, for how long have we deferred it? It seems plausible to suggest that it's impossible to invest in any act of deferral while dwelling on, or perhaps even entertaining the possibility of, its fallibility. In other words, I have to completely believe my act of deferral will succeed, at least for the period in which I am enacting it, which would further imply that I must exclude from consideration all the indications which suggest that it might not, in fact, succeed. I can and must recognize and assimilate those indications, but only in the form of those unavoidable immediate modifications in my act of deferral as I articulated. I can't imagine them as fully imagined forces which might render the act of deferral useless. The fact that I can look back afterward and note how risky the whole business in fact was can't then provide any knowledge that would be useful in the midst of the next act of deferral, except insofar as the very act of looking back itself, guided by an interest in preserving the sign, sharpens my sensitivity to the immediate appearance of counter indications. But it might just as easily dull my sensitivities to unprecedented indications. Our horizons, though, can be progressively extended insofar as any act of deferral leaves behind it a sign, which can be repeated by someone other than myself and provides a starting point for the next act of deferral, to defend that sign. Defending the sign against attempts to undermine and circumvent it, attempts made possible by the new configuration produced by the sign itself, provides for the capacity for ever-increasing foresight, especially insofar as cultural signs become increasingly complex, deferring, through a kind of ethical and aesthetic economy, a range of rivalries and crises simultaneously. In that case, though, the real threat to the sign is not so much direct attacks on it or attempts to evade its strictures, but the rivalries the sign itself instigates over who represents or embodies it. So one has to reproduce the sign in such a way as to defer conflicts generated by the previous iteration of that sign. What I've been trying to show so far is that deferral, far more than any of its near synonyms, keeps us always inside the scene, so that knowledge of the scene is always a part of concern for sustaining the scene. The concept of deferral also means we cannot really say what exactly is being deferred. No one could know that violence has been deferred, because no one can know what would have happened without the sign of deferral. Maybe it would have just been a harmless little skirmish. Implicit in an iterable sign of deferral is a worst-case scenario imaginary, albeit one that cannot be articulated. We could talk about imagination on the originary scene, insofar as we understand imagination as nothing more than a widening of the scene, so as to include something the scene will have retroactively appeared to have included. If you see two figures converging on a part of the object that can accommodate only one, you can extend the scene to include some version of irreconcilability, which can be taken to inform the convergence itself. I said last week that I would like a more precise term for the specific kind of annihilatory violence that is imagined here. It might help to remember that Gans took the notion of deferral from Derrida's difference, which includes both the word deferral and the word difference, which at bottom are the same word. So let's set aside violence for now and think in terms of the limits of sameness. The rush to the center abolishes the pre-human differences, which we can refer to as the pecking order. Suddenly, everyone is the same and sees each other becoming even more the same. The consequence of this indifferentiation is that anyone could do anything. The only check on what I might do is the difference of others, which limits and gives meaning to whatever I want or do. In myself, taken singly, I can have no constraint on desire, no project. If everyone is the same as me, no order or relation is possible. In that case, forcing some kind of response so as to make the other other, so that in turn the self can be the same as itself, becomes the only conceivable form of action. So what the gesture of deferral does is create an other for all of us, so that we can oscillate between same and other to each other. Now, the concept of deferral also has the feature of never being completed. It has no expiration date. When, after all, is the originary scene over or closed? There seem to be several complementary answers depending upon what we want to bring into focus. The scene is closed when everyone has put forth the sign and shared the differentiating hesitation before the central object. Or the scene is closed, really, and or the scene is closed once the central object has been consumed. And or the scene is closed once some ritual gesture repeating the originary gesture itself is issued. All good, but everything I just listed comes from a perspective from outside of the scene, as if these events, or this tripled event, were witnessed. But from where? Only from upon another scene. But any scene can only emerge from within a previous scene, from something resisting closure within that scene. For example, some emergent struggle over proximity to the center in the ritual gesture itself that promises closure. Each scene is then built from within a previous scene, while also being a guarantee of that previous scene's closure. But this really means that the same gesture of deferral, in all its different forms, is carried from one scene to another, while it also means that we are still on the originary scene, cognizant of its urgencies, while representing its possible closure. So we have never left and will never leave the originary scene, or its worst case imaginary, which is the very thing that makes deferral possible and must also be deferred. As soon as one takes the worst case scenario imaginary literally, one is compelled to enact it. This also means everything we do is a gesture of deferral, even the most unrestrained and violent acts. Simply by being formed, and therefore differentiating, anything we do conjures a scene by introducing some difference or some other that can sustain it. In the kind of absolute imminence I'm suggesting is implicit the gesture of deferral. In the absolute imminence I am suggesting is implicit in the gesture of deferral. What then distinguishes one gesture from another is a greater extension of the horizon of deferral, which itself implies a more formative recall of previous gestures. How do we know which gesture extends the horizon further? Obviously, we can't make a rule here. It will be a question of which gestures provide the form around which more sustaining scenes will be created. One final word. The literary aesthetic of deferral, I think, would be a single, never-ending sentence that propels itself forward by referring back to itself. And there have actually been at least a couple of novels written this way. And it may be that this talk sounded a bit like that, at least at some points, but I did rein it in, I hope, which may itself be a gesture of deferral. Okay, all done with that.
I guess I can say something first. I found a big similarity in between the way that you just described deferral, kind of ontologically, I guess you could say, because the sense that we're all still within the originary scene, and the kind of basically you just have these iterative displacements, which kind of, I said something last week about how the originary scene is like a form that ultimately you can keep filling it with new content, but like the formal structure of the problematic I stated, is ultimately kind of maintained, and it just keeps getting filled with new content, but ultimately is maintained from the originary scene to now, and that's what it was, this kind of singularity. But it was kind of a singularity that was itself kind of the kind of birthplace of new singularities, because ultimately then within, as you described, within the originary scene, there's always something left that resists closure, that ultimately produces a new differentiation, and that differentiation opens a new scene, which is just a deferral of the previous scene, and so forth down this lineage. There's a big similarity between this and Bergson's philosophy, because Bergson's trying to answer the question, where does freedom come from, basically? What is freedom or free will? And he says basically what it is hesitation. He says we can't have this kind of biodeterminist view of human cognition, because ultimately it doesn't really account for, okay, well, what happens if you have multiple schematics, which is the kind of qualia of choice. You have a situation that produces a hesitation because within the motor system you've prepared multiple responses to the same stimulus. He says if everything was determined, there would just be this kind of automatic response to stimulus. There'd be no reason for consciousness. There'd be no reason for the qualia of choice to emerge. And he says the reason why it emerges is because this virtuality, this virtual space, is kind of created in which it's kind of opened up by a deferral or a hesitation, which means ultimately your physiology is preparing multiple potential actions in response to a stimulus. And this is ultimately the ground of what he sees freedom as. And then basically he sees freedom as this kind of temporal displacement. It doesn't come from one particular moment, but comes from the build-up through temporality of a personality. And it's kind of like holistic and interpenetrating, and in its kind of heterogeneous interpenetrating structure, you have a kind of emergent personality that kind of conditions your kind of style of making these kinds of choices and gives you your habits and tendencies and so forth. This seems very similar in this sense. And so I think it's interesting where you could take this idea into, I guess, a kind of a critique along these lines of this kind of biological determinist view or biodeterminist view, and say, it doesn't actually make sense to kind of square qualia. We're kind of trying to answer like the hard problem of consciousness. So why do we have qualia of freedom, yet this seemingly deterministic structure that we explain like neurology through or something, and this seems to kind of answer it. Okay, well, you have this form of deferral that emerges through the originary or the singularity of language, and then ultimately that keeps iterating, and it can never formally be closed. And so this kind of like unleashes what Bergson would say. This kind of opens up memory, because ultimately, in order to prepare these virtual, these kind of multiple virtualities or multiple actions within virtuality, you need to have a capacity for reflection. You need to have a capacity to kind of fill in a whole bunch of prior information to give you a kind of formal structure where you can kind of use the imaginary, to use your term, to kind of game out where things would go. So that you can actually make a decision. Or if I did this, then this, and this would happen. Or if I did this, maybe this, and this would happen. And you need to have these these virtual scenes where you kind of simulate what would happen if I did this versus that. That's the only way it would be possible to kind of fear one outcome and choose another outcome as a solution and so forth. And this
so tell me, for Bergson in that case, okay, so he accounts for memory, and so I'm wondering whether he accounts for language and culture and so on. But set that aside for now. Does, of all these kind of multiple potentialities for action that presumably kind of in a sense present themselves when you're confronted with some new exigency that you have to act in response to, is there any particular reason why one of them would be kind of in a sense permitted to take the forefront as opposed to all of the others? And is there any way in which, once that kind of choice or decision has been made, does that then create a kind of constraint on the way all those multiple possibilities kind of gets sorted out the next time, and then the next time. In other words,
Yeah, he kind of describes how ultimately you form like that personality and freedom doesn't come from some arbitrary, alienated moment where you just, as if like you're just like as if freedom would be this kind of random outcome generator. Oh, I'm just going to pick this without thinking about it. He says freedom ultimately comes from you develop a personality, you make certain investments and commitments, and you form certain habits over a period of time, and it takes time to kind of like if as soon as you're born, as like and you're a newborn baby, you don't really have capacity for freedom or memory or language. Really, you have potential for that to develop that, but you don't really have any. You don't have a personality. You just kind of automatic essentially. But then over time, through your interaction with others, you start to develop a personality and you start to imitate others and so forth. And this ends up giving you a kind of temporal context, so that when you are confronted with a decision, then within the physiology, you have attention by virtue of the fact that you can feel your body preparing multiple different responses. But then ultimately, the decision that you choose, he sees this as in the purview of virtuality, which is ultimately and therefore memory. And so he says ultimately, it's you kind of have to kind of impose. I guess he would say language, but you have to impose like a form upon your experience in order to perceive it, because he describes how the present, a kind of a thick present, where you don't really ever perceive just the present. You perceive the present constantly mixed up with memory, because even though he describes like I can't recognize this computer as a computer without a whole bunch of experiences contextualizing what a computer is and previous other computers and so forth to know this is an actual computer. If I don't perceive it as a computer just because I'm making it up with a set of inferences in one moment. So I'm constantly mixing memory in to all of my experiences all the time. And this process, because memory has a certain form, and that form is essentially the personality. And so it's this kind of like dynamic process where it kind of feeds back into itself. And I think this is similar to what you're describing in this kind of iteration of scenes. There's these certain these certain aspects that resist closure. And ultimately, if you keep kind of iterating scene after scene after scene, there's a certain trajectory, there's a certain nature to your movement through time that that we would understand as, particularly even if you're thinking about not just in terms of your personal life, but if you think about it on the character of a nation, or Heidegger's concept of historicity is basically bound up in this. Like, if people always talk about what as a white man or as a Westerner or as an Australian or whatever I was going to say, these things are obviously historical statements that have to do with a whole bunch of scenes being iterated up to this point that I'm kind of perceiving myself as standing, that I'm kind of in this moment is like an outcome of those scenes in a certain way. You never really perceive a single moment kind of alienated from that. So
right, yeah. Well, in other words, yeah. I mean, there's a kind of notion of continuity, right? It's kind of in a sense an unbroken stream, right? An unbroken stream that at the same time keeps taking on different shapes. So there's a kind of oscillation between. I mean, a scene has a very definite shape in the sense it takes on, to be a completed scene. It gets more and more informed in the sense of taking a more and more set and complex form. Right, each person is kind of arrayed in a sense in relation to everyone else, and it's kind of referring to and adapting to and provoking whatever everybody else in the scene, and each person is kind of in a sense recording and taking in and devising new responses in relation to everyone else, and this gets more and more in a sense kind of fixed, and then the very fact that it gets fixed is then what opens up new possibilities, because the very fact that it gets fixed is that's what generates something like an anomaly on the scene, because then there's going to end up being some access to something or some kind of appropriation or address that can't be shared, as the scene is in a sense kind of
there's always a difference that resists repetition, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But where it gets interesting for Bergson, which is why it corresponds with GA so much, is because that he brings in this idea of geometrical thinking or spatial thinking, and it has a lot of correspondence, I think, with the declarative being alienated. Like it's kind of like it's describing another aspect of the same process, where you have this continuity of scenes, which is the basis of language, but then you have spatial comprehension in which we have to kind of, instead of understanding things as this kind of interpenetrating continuity, we have to insert intervals and therefore discontinuities in order to understand something geometrically. And this is where he describes like deterministic, bi-deterministic accounts of consciousness ultimately come from, is trying to understand them in terms of space rather than time. So we divide them up into objects that have juxtaposed relations with intervals inserted between them that are kind of static in this atemporal abstract domain. And then we have to account for their relations to one another and build our model of causality that can ultimately operate them as a kind of machine that could drive a process. So we have to we're imposing temporality upon them, but he tries to flip that relation and show how it's, in the same way that we can't base the declarative in a certain way does this. Like we can't base everything in the declarative, because the declarative is kind of this like suspension of the temporality of the scene. Gans describes how you have, the mistaken assensive, essentially point at something and it's not there. So you get the imperative, but ultimately if the imperative can't maintain that continuity by supplying what's supposed to be there, it becomes an interrogative, and therefore it becomes problematic, and that requires us to go and search for a declarative to account for absence. And so this kind of absent scene is kind of atemporal and projected outside of the temporal flow of these scenes being iterated. Essentially, it's a kind of a suspension. And so I think it's actually, they're describing two aspects of the same process. And so then the kind of the flip of these relations that occurs with, the birth of philosophy in ancient Greece, it's the same, they're kind of describing the same kind of flip from two different angles where, you have this projection of this spatial domain that has declarative juxtaposed relations to one another. And then you try and build your model of what time is like out of that. And it's a mistake because it's actually the secondary, not the primary phenomenon.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is a kind of oscillation between, in a sense, two manifestations of the same thing. I mean, I don't know, maybe ultimately we'd have, it'd be useful to even talk about Spinoza in this context, right? This, God and nature kind of, sort of materiality and intellect are really just kind of two different modes of the same process. And it's just like, in a sense, you have to see the scene. To see it as a scene, you have to kind of see it as closed, but that kind of already implies you're off the scene, because you can only see one scene as being closed if you're kind of, spectator of the scene. But then if you're a spectator, then you're on this other scene along with other spectators. And that's a scene in itself. And you can't realize that to the extent that you're focusing on the scene, that you're imposing some kind of closure. And yeah, I mean, so in a sense you have to do it. And if there's an ethics to all of this, then the ethics is kind of to be, maximally aware that you're kind of, oscillating this way. You're on both sides at the same time, and to kind of keep that open, and not see the other part of the process as, as something alien, as something hostile, something that needs to be shut down.
Yeah, what you're describing is basically Deleuze's ethics, because he combines Bergson with Spinoza to make this point, and then ultimately that's his reading of Nietzsche, which is he reads Nietzsche's eternal return as this perpetual iteration, the kind of repetition of difference that he sees. So ultimately what he sees as unethical would be the kind of bureaucratic constraint, the kind of denial that we're constantly iterating new scenes and reflecting back upon previous scenes in this dynamic temporal process, but instead this attempt to kind of freeze the lines that have been drawn and the distinctions that have been drawn and the relations between those distinctions from continuing, and treat it as though it is completely stagnated. And the kind of motive for this politically is ultimately to defend our investments when we engage in this kind of bureaucratic action, because we have a certain interest in maintaining the relations as they are, because perhaps they're beneficial to us in certain ways, and we have certain power and status and so security and so forth. And so we're very the bureaucrat defends this against kind of language which resists, attempts to kind of trace lines of flight, use the Deleuzian term, outside of the kind of space that has been what he calls striated space, essentially, that's been kind of imposed upon an order. This is how it is, and that's all she wrote, kind of thing. Which is again this kind of spatial, this kind of Bergson sees this kind of spatialized metaphysics, we set up these juxtaposed relations, and they're kind of foundational to everything. And everything is basically, we try to derive continuity from a discontinuous model. We try to derive time from an atemporal model, and we try to derive becoming from being. And this is a fundamental ontological mistake, because it doesn't actually make sense how it could get going. If you were starting out with these stagnant relations, you can't kind of have everything stagnant and then somehow they relate to each other. They can only ever really stay in their places, and they can't move. And so we have to kind of presume movement first. And that's, I think, where your thinking comes in this idea. We have this kind of eternally recurring problematic driving us to keep, every time we kind of reflect upon a scene, we're creating a new one. And there's constantly this, as you say, this aspect that resists, this kind of difference that always resists the kind of structure of any one scene. And to honor the center, we have to keep following it.
Yeah, right. I guess what GA kind of is adding to all of this, at least one central thing that it's adding is this notion of mimetic convergence on a center, and this possibility of kind of cataclysmic violence, which like you don't know whether it would have happened or not, right? It's so in a certain sense that's an imaginary constructed by the sign itself, but it seems to me that what kind of takes it out of philosophy, even though of course I'm very welcoming of all of these overlappings with GA and my version of GA and all these other ways of thinking. It seems to me that the idea of a scene kind of configured, constellated around the center, that in a sense it makes it in a sense anthropological, social, and so on, in a way that that it seems to me that maybe there are exceptions, but philosophy doesn't rarely quite kind of gets at. I mean, maybe Deleuze does, but I'm not so sure. With Deleuze, it always seems to me to be these various relations between kind of concepts that he's moving around, and I don't know if he's really thinking scenically, but I could be wrong about that.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
I think well, obviously philosophy is kind of coming out of a critique of itself, and so the good philosophy that I'm referring to, it's obviously kind of directed at previous iterations of metaphysics and trying to do something with the problems it presents. So it's within that tradition.
Yeah, sure. GA is in that tradition, of course. I mean,
in a certain way, yeah. I think in terms of, I think the main difference is more with this notion of the center having this. I think this is the only philosopher that I think reproduces a similar philosophy to you in this regard is Heidegger. This idea of this kind of continuing center that has this so the kind of moral terms in which you describe it. I don't think Deleuze really Deleuze kind of overemphasizes difference, and I think underemphasizes the kind of repetition of form that kind of underlies it. Probably because he's kind of this French radical anarchistic kind of thinker, and so it makes sense that that's the direction he goes in.
It's sort of a trivial way to put it, I think, but there always seems to be something kind of manic about Deleuze.
Yeah, later in his work, definitely. I mean, partially because he co-authored those books with Guattari, who's a nutcase. But if you read Deleuze's books on, which I highly recommend, his books on Kant, Nietzsche, and Bergson, they're very lucid and clear. They're not. They're polar opposite to a lot of his other work. And if you read his last major work, What is Philosophy? That's also quite lucid, because Guattari is listed as a co-author, but apparently Guattari was basically in the hospital, so he couldn't really participate very much at all in the actual writing of the book. So it's Deleuze's kind of signing off, and those texts are quite lucid. So he shows, and if you read the transcripts of his lectures, he shows that he's capable of speaking with great lucidity and clarity. But I think there's a certain kind of French style at the time that you get with a lot of these writers like Derrida and Foucault and so forth, where they have a certain, I think it's kind of alienating to kind of the Anglo a spherical reader because we like clear, structured, simple presentation. They like having lots of flair and complexity and esoteric language for whatever reason. So it's a bit of an obstacle.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, you don't really want to let that get too much in the way of anything. I mean,
I think he has this idea of what he calls becoming imperceptible. So I think his idea with that was by being purposefully ambiguous, this kind of prevents others from actually knowing what you're doing. So there was people like Foucault or Derrida or whatever. Oh yeah, Deleuze is great. They don't realize that Deleuze is actually like chopping the legs off key aspects of their system. And I think that was kind of intentional. He kind of wanted to be ambiguous because if he came out and said with clarity what he meant, it would have been quite controversial at the time because he was really kind of attacking Marxism and attacking like a lot of like core aspects of like human rights ideology and liberal ideology and so forth. Even though he kind of like flirts with certain ideas that he probably shouldn't be and all of this. So I think that's kind of an intentional aspect. Well, anyway.
Let's hear from Anthony.
If I can. Oh, there we go. Actually, this question is for Joel. Not having read Bergson, I don't know what he means exactly by memory as a repetition of form. Is he talking about something which is just localized to individuals, like a physiological memory, or could it be like the memory of a people or the memory that's in language or something like that? And the reason I'm asking that is because it seems that the way you describe Bergson, this memory is part that is constitutive of making a free will and making choice. And so, you don't want to fall back into this kind of a liberal ontology of just saying, oh, we all have this free will and it's an individual choice and so on. And, if you have memory and it's just localized to the individual, you might then be able to reduce all of Bergson to just like individual choice, which has a problem. Whereas if you think of memory as something which is more the memory of a people, and I'm not even sure how physiologically that would manifest itself, except maybe through some kind of reflection in other people's minds. But then you could say something like, our choices, my choice is not an individual choice because it's a choice which is already caught up in this collective memory. And so I'm just wondering if you can clarify what Bergson means about that and maybe tie it back to GA. And I hope I asked my question right, because I'm half formulating these questions as I say them out loud.
Yeah, so Bergson's idea of memory is that it is virtual. So he opens this ontological category of virtuality, which is basically this abstract space, which he says is essentially spirit, which is a kind of a loaded term, which gets opened up by this hesitation because there's basically this virtual. Basically, it's what the imagination is that we actually experience. So this is like a place where we can develop these virtual schematic structures that prepare actions and simulate outcomes and so forth. He doesn't really go beyond that into a deeper exploration. So I think the best way, like Stiegler just like takes Derrida's idea of, there is two aspects to the virtual. There is the virtual as difference, which is, I guess, a more of an individual, a kind of existential kind of style of deferral, which is that, memory is for me in a way that it isn't for you or anyone else, in the sense that I have a certain sense of my memories that I can actually think of and bring up in my mind that are obviously my memories that have to do with my actual physiological experiences and my embodiment in the world. But then you also have the deferral aspect of virtuality, which Bergson doesn't touch as much. He kind of does in Creative Evolution by describing how evolution itself has this vitality, which is itself has a virtuality, and that we're kind of plugged into that. But Heidegger explores the question more in terms of the cultural domain. And I think GA explores it more in terms of language. If we're constantly inhabiting scenes, I mean, this is particularly obvious in like ritual societies, for example. There are certain positions and characters and methods of dressing and appropriatenesses and so forth that get passed down. But we have so many rituals in our society, even though we have a so-called post-ritual society. I mean, in a certain sense, like the election is a ritual, or in a certain sense, on Christmas, everyone puts a tree in their house. Why? We don't actually know why. We kind of just do it. It's just what people do. There's obviously all these kinds of rituals that are kind of still embedded in society that have certain significances that the individual doesn't necessarily produce for himself in himself. And so, yeah, Bergson's kind of underdeveloped that idea, I think. But his philosophy doesn't kind of force you to neglect it, because he does acknowledge that language is the kind of operator of virtuality. So that means if you kind of have a theory of language, like Heidegger does, or like GA does in particular, which has this kind of historicity, then that accounts for that. So I hope that answered the question. I mean, if you want to talk more about Bergson, we probably can later, because I don't want to distract too much from Adam.
No, I was. I mean, what I like about GA is precisely what you mentioned, which is the communal aspect. And so my antennas simply came up when you were talking about Bergson in terms of memory, and wondering, I think you answered the question though, that Bergson does not exclude that possibility. So yeah, you did answer the question.
Yeah, one thing someone mentioned, Schmidt in the kind of side comments there, and and in a sense, this notion of the exception is, it also, I think, belongs within within originary thinking, right? Because it's the same kind of how, so someone has to decide. Well, how do you decide, right? Which there's two sides, each has its kind of legal arguments, and ultimately. Yeah, you can't really distinguish one legal argument from another, even if one seems to have more points on its side, the other maybe has the more important point. But how do you distinguish between more and less important, interpretations or kind of layers of legal reasoning and tradition and so on? So ultimately, it does come down to to a decision, and so a decision on the one hand seems to be almost sort of the exact opposite of deferral. Right, so I want to come back to this to kind of talk about. I always kind of want to let's say defer the possible conclusion that GA is ultimately, just like I wanted to defer the idea that it's kind of a sort of passivism because it's about deferring violence. I just want to defer the idea that it means you never really make a decision, right? You're always like it's a kind of wishy-washy, constant hesitation, not wanting to ever come down on one side or another. When ultimately, I think properly understood, it's really the exact opposite of that, right? It's a question, you're making, to put forward a sign is itself, a decision, and to take an action within a particular social setting is also a sign, right? And you're putting it forward in the most decisive action, saying, "Here, I'm going to stand here. Everyone who wants to be on my side, gather around my side right now. Here's what I want." And so on, here's what we're going to do. That itself is, a sign of deferral, insofar as it opens it up for everyone else to take decisions that you're kind of making possible, but you're not determining in advance. Because now, in a sense, you're kind of forming a new space, and you're inviting everyone who wants into that space. And even everyone who doesn't want is being invited in relation to that space in some way. So you're configuring an entire scene. And the more decisive and clear your action is, and the more it kind of draws upon all the resources available to you and makes it clear that you're drawing upon all of those resources, the more that's brought into play, the more, in fact, it's a sign, right? And it's, in fact, a sign of deferral. Because what you're deferring in that case is the kind of chaos and uncomprehension that's going to come if someone doesn't do that, right? And by doing that, now you open up for everybody else to take some kind of place within that configuration. You kind of open up, it's like you kind of write the beginnings of a script, and everybody else has to sort of follow up on that script and write their own parts as they're acting those parts and so on. So there's definitely, I think, a kind of decisionism that is not only compatible with GA, but is really, in a sense, constitutive.
I would say also, when you make a decision, you obviously you're running mental simulations as to what the outcome of that decision is, how that's going to, because you obviously, like Tomaselli talks about, like the basis of language is third order intentionality, the ability to read the intentions of others and then to kind of perform a mental simulation. If I was to act in this way or say this is how they would probably respond, and how other people would respond in turn, and so forth. And the most important decisions, or the most skilled decision makers, like particularly in the political arena, they have to run very complex mental simulations of how their decisions are going to impact. And obviously, they're not always going to get everything right, but they have some kind of idea of what they're trying to achieve. Obviously, it's motivating the decision in the first place. If I don't do this, this will happen. If I do this, this will happen, and so forth. And so everyone's always constantly making positions from like a simulated future reflecting back upon its outcome. And so in a certain sense, we're kind of opening up a space of future deferral, so to speak, that we're kind of retroactively deciding from, or founding, or initiating in the Schmittian sense. Particularly if you think about it in terms of a juridical order, like law is ultimately obviously a space of deferral by definition. It's ultimately a set of rules that we'll draw up, say, well, look, this is the terms of agreement between us. We're going to kind of agree not to violate any of these, this kind of codification of limitations of our behavior. And then ideally we then get a civil society in which we can kind of peacefully coexist and ally with one another and cooperate, because we have the security of mutual deferral, So obviously that's kind of always what's being done in the juridical Schmittian sense, is recognizing, well, there's something that's broken down, like the juridical order no longer functions in a way where we're actually creating a civic society. We have a fracture. We have a fundamental problematic, and so we have to imagine what amendments would need to be made for us to return to a civic society. And usually that's obviously mediated by conflict and what Schmitt describes as the friend-enemy distinction. You have to define who's in and outside of that agreement, and usually the reason why there's a problem is because a certain faction is attacking you or threatening you or something. So you usually have to redraw those lines, and people that used to be a member of the order are now excluded, or what have you. So, but yeah, I always thought that Schmitt's theories were like an obvious kind of antecedent to Adam's theories. I've seen them described as I've seen Schmitt described as like a post-liberal political theorist, or the first post-liberal political theorist before. So.
Yeah, I mean, a decision connects, some past with some possible future, right? And that's basically what the sign does as well. It kind of, in a sense, channels the past, something from the past, in a particular direction, so as to make one future more likely than another, right? And that's basically what deferral is doing. So yeah, it's a question of reading actions as signs. Really, you read action as a sign, then yes, it's a form of deferral, and it's just a question of figuring out what's getting deferred, right? Through this process, what we kind of take to be deferred as a result, and how we, and you can only do that as you're kind of contributing to it, one way or another.
And obviously, like signs, we're constantly creating mental models in our head. I keep using this phrase, in our head. I should just say we always create mental models of simulations of the future, and kind of we place them behind us to give us a sense of the momentum of any situation and the context and so forth. And those basically what signs are, they're kind of attached to certain, you could say, drawing techniques in the kind of construction of these models. That's what makes each move in the kind of their formation intelligible. They have a kind of equivalence. We're kind of naming a certain form or subform within the overall model.
Well, a good way of talking about this now, and the way I'm coming more and more to talk about it, and it kind of intersects with what I see as a lot of powerful contemporary thinking, is through the notion of design, right? If we think about ourselves as kind of designing scenes, everything that we're doing is designing scenes that open up, certain possibilities, right? You design something, right? You design a building, or you design kind of a stage set, or whatever. You design clothing, right? All these things, they're all, it's all designing kind of an array of signs within a media that that provide people with particular ways of configuring themselves in relation to each other. So then that becomes a good way of talking about all kinds of things, right? So even so right now, what exactly are we designing, or any one of us designing, by saying this or that, right? We're designing, some space in which certain possible responses are going to be more likely and more viable and more kind of felicitous and effective than other possible responses. So, the more you think about it, it's obviously thinking in performative terms and in a sense, pragmatic terms. And that's what a sign is, right? It's kind of setting things up in that way. So you kind of avoid, the internalization of it, right? You're thinking, I'm following up in a sense of you talking about, having a model in your head. And, again, there's nothing really wrong with speaking in those terms, right? We don't want to, there's all kinds of vocabularies we could use. But of course, the reason I'm guessing why you want to hesitate about that is because, there's, once you start kind of internalizing, thoughts and ideas and so on, then in a sense you get back into metaphysics, right? And the way here out of metaphysics, through all the examples that we're looking at here, the way out of metaphysics is really by looking at a more kind of scenic, performative dimension where we're talking about the way in which things register and counter-register within within a particular setting, and so that kind of takes out of either something above or something inside of us that's the final arbiter of things.
I mean, I think metaphysics is an annoying word, but I don't think we can ever escape ontology, and usually these words are used interchangeably in philosophy. I think what we're describing is ontology, because the reason why I'm hesitant to say my model's in my head is because obviously the location of my head, of whatever's inside my head, is itself within a model that I have. So it's kind of, I'm just kind of concealing like a larger model that I'm putting other models in. But I think relating this to something more practical, looking at conservatives, to bring Schmidt and everything that we've been describing and Deferral in, and look at what I'm thinking about trying to do with the intellectual work that we have for the journal, that I have in my head planned for the journal, and I can see other people doing, is looking at conservatism. And like the fundamental problem with conservatism, in my view, is that they're playing by rules that their opponents don't play by, and so they're kind of being handicapped by standards that basically then get used as a weakness for them to be like perpetual losers. Whether you look at, Republicans put people on the Supreme Court who interpret the law as it's stated. Leftists put Supreme Court picks that change the laws to suit them. And so it's like, I know like the left will rig the votes, but we'll never rig the votes. Can you imagine if it was the other way around, what the response would be or whatever? So we can never actually break any of these rules, but our opponents constantly can. And so many of the right allies, one of the major ones being like, capitalism or whatever, I think is a terrible framework where the right ends up allying with the rights. You see like still like Ben Shapiro defending the right of Twitter to censor people. They're a private company and America's a capitalist country. The government can't tell them what to do or whatever. And so you get into the right gets itself into all these like immobilizations because it can't draw the friend enemy distinction, right? It can't read. It has a shit model basically. It's like deferring to a game that its opponents aren't deferring to, and so it's just getting beaten, slapped around constantly. And so what needs to be done is the whole model needs to be redesigned. The right needs to perceive its position in history differently. It needs to perceive economics differently and legal theory differently and all these different things so that it can actually defend itself and recognize that it's treating an enemy like an ally in so many different ways. And so that's what I see the point of trying to relate all of this work to theory of history and political economy and jurisprudence and so forth, ultimately being is trying to give the right like help in constructing a new model that's capable of actually mobilizing it in a way that enables it to strategically win. Because
right, in a way, in a sense, what would be, on a very practical level, the kind of significance of that is developing the habit of cultivating constituencies in all of those places where you think you're not allowed to cultivate constituencies, right? The idea that the military should be right wing, the idea that, say, police forces should be right wing, the idea that there should be a right wing academy, the idea that that all of these should be seen as a sense patrons of the right. You should be building kind of relations and people ready to act with you in all of these institutions would be seen as completely fascist by conservatives themselves. But of course, if you're not doing that, then the other side is doing that. So you need an intellectual frame which lets you know that you have a right and an obligation to do this, right? To maintain cultural continuity across all of these different institutions, and to have people who, are not just, in a sense, loyalty to the Constitution is the kind of, within the U.S. at least, it's going to be a kind of primary sort of obligation, but you want to make sure then that there's an interpretation of loyalty to the Constitution that builds lots of other things. It's got to be a much thicker, right? It's thickness that really is necessary. A much thicker understanding of what it means to be loyal to the Constitution, that would allow for much less, tolerance in terms of what's a permissible deviation from that. That would have to be inculcated all across the board. Everything is should be within this, including corporations, including schools, including the military. Everything you should be working within all of this, because the left does, right? The very fact that the left has these kind of racial equity trainings in every single institution. I mean, including the military, and of course including corporations. That's their kind of indoctrination. That's their developing political constituencies across all of these institutions. And unless you're doing that, then the consequences are obvious.
Well, of course. I mean, like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, like these guys, they never said, "Oh, we're going to have a constitution operate for infinite amount of time, and it's going to be great." They said, at some point, it's going to go wrong, and you guys are going to need to have another revolution and do this again. That was pretty clear. In like, the Second Amendment isn't like having a handgun so that like you don't get mugged. The Second Amendment is the ability to go to war and create a new government. So I think there's a decent amount of militancy on the right. There's just a lack of capacity of thinking about an actual policy trajectory. Like how do you design a legal system and an economic system that would work to achieve certain outcomes without. Obviously, there's a fear we don't want to become communists or whatever, because communism ostensibly didn't work out too well. So there's certain like reasonable problems on the right. Okay, well, communism is bad, therefore we need free markets, and it's like you have to interject the idea that it's a false dichotomy and that there's an alternative to this dichotomy in their head, or that's kind of, it's the right's defensive. It's like there's all these left-wing positions that they find to be wrong, and so they've just built defenses of some more classical position, say, well, you're trying to change things in a way that would be worse, and so we'd rather keep it how it is. But the fact that keeping it how it is was unable to defend itself against all these changes means we have to come up with something completely different. I think a lot of people are going to be ready to hear that message, because ostensibly these institutions are kind of falling apart every night. Anyone who watches Tucker Carlson, he's basically kind of screaming at the camera, our institutions aren't working. They're not playing by the rules, for half an hour every night on Fox or whatever. That seems to be like the common feeling, and that's only going to get stronger. Recent events,
definitely fertile ground for a very kind of serious, kind of intellectual realignment of all of these questions. And that's what we're here for, right? That's what we're trying to do.
But anyway, is there anything anyone else would like to say?
Okay, well, thanks. I hope I'll see you again next week. And okay, now we can go back and see what the latest in the